the narration was written by us, which is told from the point of view of this member of the troupe, Tarek Ali. We chose him because he was the one who was seen most frequently in close-ups and in the kinds of shots which you could consider to be point of view shots, sort of over-the-shoulder shots. It was either him or one other of the women members of the troupe, but she didn't have as much material on her, so by default it became him. And we decided, every step of the way is a creative decision that we make. So we decided that, yes, we were going to be in the moment of the film. We knew all the troupe members. We could have made a film interviewing them now and then cutting to the footage then and going back then and now. But we wanted to get into that moment. So the narration was written in the present as if, it was a diary that he was keeping as they were moving through the refugee camps and the liberated zones. Many other things were scripted also by us. For example, there are two scenes with the puppets with Yahya Khan. The first one we used the original sound, but the second one was completely scripted, actually, and recorded in New York in 1993. In fact, little sub-fact here was that the whole film was in fact made in New York.
The second scene is the one I showed?
The second one is the one you showed.
Where he says Ghulam Hussain rather than the real name.
Yeah, that was all scripted by us in the aftermath. I mean, it was a peculiar film to make because in a way we were making it backwards. We were dealing with material. I mean, there's a genre of documentaries called compilation film where you're compiling a film from material that's already been shot. So largely that's what this film was, and yet it needed to be scripted. We needed to organize it. We needed to decide what is it really going to be about, because we had 30, 40 hours of footage to choose from, including all of the other archival that we collected from other places around the world. So about 65-70% of the film was material from Lear Levin, and then the rest of it was other archival, which we used to create more context for the stories, such as Bhutto at the UN, for example, or the black and white footage at the beginning, or the newsreel footage you see at the end of the 16th December celebration. So, I mean, our idea from the outset, as we formulated it, was that we were going to make a film that was sort of a hybrid, and it would feel like it was true, it was documentary, because of the handheld shots and the sync sound and the archival look to it, and yet it was structured like a fiction film in many ways. And the musical part of it also had a lot to do with that, I would say. It was sort of a road movie, right? And so it was somewhat surprising to us that people just sort of insisted that it was a true document, no matter what we said. And often we gave introductions to the film, actually, when we released it, sort of explaining the background of it. I don't remember exactly what we said, but we did talk about how we reconstructed certain things we take. Once you get into that space, into that time, because we had created a document that sucked you into its own world, its own space, people believed that was part of their world also, because we were dealing with themes that had such massive emotional weight to them. And I think, that in those circumstances, logic, analysis, those things would take a backseat. But, I would say that there was definitely an exception to the way the audience was perceived. Yes, when it was shown, particularly to middle class audiences, urban audiences, they definitely sort of followed that pattern that Naeem is talking about in his paper. But we spent 3 years showing the film around the country. We actually had a mobile projection unit. We would travel from small town to small town, village to village. For 3 years we did that. And, you know, it became clear to us that there was this gap in the way that people perceive the film between that urban middle class or lower middle class audience and the way it was perceived by ordinary farmers, villagers, who looked at the film and they said, you know, that is not really the way the war was for us. These people are very privileged, you know, they're borolok, they're, you know,
They speak
wealthy.
English in some scenes.
They speak English in some scenes. The guy who said he couldn't fight because, you know, his eyesight was too poor. I mean, you know, does not ring true to us because we just went out. Nobody had to screen us, you know, to join the freedom fights. We just went on our own and fought. And so we started to actually record them. We would show the film, and then we would sit with these villagers afterwards, and we'd record them. And you know, there's a certain narrative about the war, which is really, it's what we call kind of Bengali nationalism, right? But we would show it in parts of the country where people were not predominantly Bengali, for example, to tribal people, you know, in the border zones. So they took it a different way also. So there was an ethnic divide, there was a class divide, and there was a rural-urban divide in terms of the perception. And I would say that insistence on the realism of the film fell away. It just fell away as soon as you got outside the domains of that audience, an important audience, you know, an opinion-making audience of the urban, you know, elites. But we ended up making a follow-up film to this, which was actually our own critique of our own work. And it was also, in some way, an homage to that other kind of more subaltern story of the war. It was called MUKTIR, Words of Freedom, where, you know, we start off by showing the film. We show the release of the film in the city and interview some young people, and they're very excited and they're shaking, you know, they're so excited about, you know, what they've seen on the screen, and they talk about how real it is to them. And then we start moving outside the city with our team of projectionists.
And that's from the projection.
That's from the projection, yeah. And then, you know, as we interact with these audiences, they start to critique the film and give their own version of what happened to them. And another element also, which you mentioned, is, I think also comes out very clearly in Naeem Mohaiemen's critique, is, except for the last line of the film, we had that there for a reason, to raise that question of, have we done justice for the cause for which these people fought and died, the freedom fighters? We answer that question in the next film, because really it's about the post-war reality and the bitterness that followed the war, the collapse of that dream of unity and, you know, egalitarianism.
I think the class aspect, because the
class
soldiers at the end are
aspect.
all peasants.
But also the ethnic aspect as well comes into play. And the religious aspect, you know, the marginalization of Hindus, even though the war was sort of fought on this pretext of equal, you know, equal respect for all religions. But that did not play out that way in the aftermath. So, you know, I think that was our way of coming to terms with some of the issues that you raise in your piece. And, you know, I think we felt as filmmakers that it was really important to be part of that whole process of showing the film. Because that's where we would learn the most about our own work, was through these interactions with the audience. And although we had set out to make a film which we knew was in some ways a fiction, but true in the greater sense of the term, we ended up, I think, understanding the war and the post-war period in a much more complex way.
I was trying to look up the poster for Nari Rekattur, which was the third film.
Yeah, that was sort of a spin-off from Words of Freedom. It's called Women in War in English, which is about this experience of women during the war. Right.
Right,
And there was also footage that we had collected during that whole 3-year period that we used for that.
right, and I think, not to get into that detail, but one story in that ends up surfacing in Meher Jan in different ways, which it'll take too long to get into that.
Yeah.
But one of the
Oh, it would relate in relation to what you're saying about war crimes and the war crimes tribunals in Bangladesh. Actually, MUKTIR GAAN was not a witnessing document in that sense, but MUKTIR Kota was actually, and so we did a whole sort of chapter on that in our film, and sort of dissecting, the idea of war criminals and how they've been rehabilitated in the aftermath of the war, because the mayor of this locality had actually been the chief collaborator who had brought the army into this village and helped them, round up all of the villagers to be killed. And so he was later put on trial during the time of the war crimes tribunals. So that's kind of an interesting twist on that as well.
I think it's worth talking about the passage of time, because the thing that I was always struck by, lived within it myself in 1995, and then from distance can see it very clearly, that in 1995 to make films about the war was a resistant and minority position. There was a hostile government at the time, and there was general hostility towards films about the war. That vignette I read about the censor board, that was kind of notorious. If you wanted to make a film about the war, you basically just wouldn't get it passed without having a certain kind of hero and a certain kind of villain. So people in some ways made less and less films about the war. And in 1995, when the film was about to come out, the censor board basically tried to block it, which was a very typical position. So I don't want to use the word subaltern, but a minority position and a position of resisting state power in some ways, or resisting the grand narrative which was against the war. But by 2013, 20 years later, during the Shahbag movement, and certainly today, 2019, the narrative of the war is not a resistant position anymore. Mm-hmm. It's actively instrumentalized by the war, by the government, and its allied cultural forces, and it's used as a silencing mechanism. The most typical, somewhat careless, but very easy to pull off in the age of social media and cancel culture is to tag someone as pro-Pakistani because of something they've written. And that's a tag that if someone gets attached to them, almost impossible to shake off, and impossible to prove or disprove in any case. So one of the things about this film or any film about the war is we're now, of course, we're in 2020, but we're also in a situation now where not this film necessarily, but the war narrative is also an instrument of power now. The war narrative is an instrument to say dissident views cannot be tolerated and this is why. So instead of being about, let's say, the peasant soldier and will Bangladesh represent, or will Bangladesh fulfill their needs, it's actually now an instrument of the most ferocious, if nothing else, neoliberal capitalist state.
Yes.
A vast surveillance mechanism and a vast suppression mechanism, similar to other countries also. So for many of us, we've had to travel from the war narrative being sacred and hard to find to now being very wary of the war narrative, especially the ones that come with government funding or that come with the visibility, which is not this film, of course. There was a hostile government in power, but we're talking about the film in the context of now, right? Where
this is how these things get manipulated, because it's painful to see that some of the symbolic imagery of the film has been used for opposite purposes than what it was intended because of that changeover.
What's an example?
Sorry?
What's an example?
Well, I would just say, I mean, sort of the most, more reactionary elements of this sort of dominant ideology being expressed in the form of state power now. This is the official narrative, right? Where that official narrative is most powerfully projected, images of the film, such as, the painting that we had made when the film was made, those are kind of, cut pieces of that are sort of attached as graphics for those statements. And the video, I mean, the image, the actual film, pieces of the film also are woven into, pieces of propaganda, right? To project that official dominant narrative.
I'm actually locating an image that will maybe crystallize immediately for people what's at stake. One of the most frightening images that came out of the moment. It's like there were these children, who were, 1-year-old Masud child, as people say, on the shoulder of his father or uncle, and the chant is, "We want the news, we want the news." It's profound for a society that the single largest uprising, not to talk about globalism, but Occupy Wall Street very broadly was anti-capitalist, and Arab Spring was broadly pro-democracy, and Shahbag came right afterwards, same period. And that's, as I said, it was initially called Shahbag Square for about a week before people decided, no, this is not Shahbag Square. So to have a Bangladeshi uprising, which is youth, social media, internet, in the same period, with its fundamental demand being, we don't care what the trial process has found, these people have to be hanged, right? So if the trial process found them not guilty, you have to now reverse it with people power. So even many of us who are invested in certainly trials for war criminals as a process of truth and reconciliation couldn't embrace what the movement became. And one of the things I heard social media is very much part of the story because it's 2013. One of the things I heard often on social media is to describe people, myself included, as, oh, you used to be on our side, now you've gone astray. So the idea also that, if you're not with the consensus, something's happened to you. You've been gotten to, which accelerated by social media is, can be profound. It's like cancel culture multiplied by a population of 160 million and whatever the internet penetration is, which is very large in Bangladesh. Social media accelerated mob behavior is not exactly limited to South Asia, it's everywhere. But it was certainly, it was frightening to see it up front. And also I feel that one of the things that I saw in that moment is what you did before didn't matter. It didn't matter. In a way, because Tariq Masud passed away tragically, he was saved from having to see this moment, because I'm sure that he would have taken a strong position against this, and then people would have said, oh yes, you made that film, you both made that film, but now there was also that thing where your track record of working on this topic didn't matter when you strayed from the official line.
So in this growing era of nationalism, and in Shahbag, this movie was misused to such an extent, do you see the responsibility of a filmmaker changing in how they depict realities and complexities? Because in many ways, so the puppeteering was very, very extreme, and I could see it being used in a propaganda. And growing up in the 90s, I feel like the war was a way to feel culturally Bengali, but now the narrative has shifted to being very anti-Pakistan, and you sort of use these things. So then as a filmmaker, do you see your responsibility now changing a little bit in how you depict complexities of the war?
Just to clarify, I don't think it's anti-Pakistan as much as Pakistan is actually very little in the narrative. It's much more about being. It's a cleansing campaign inside the country. I've yet to see a film which fantasizes some sort of James Bond operation that flies into Pakistan and captures a soldier and brings them back for trial. The sort of things that post-Holocaust films used to do all the time. That's not the focus. The focus is internal cleansing. The main anger is reserved for those who are
Collaborated.
Bengali or whatever term you want to use, who collaborated with the Pakistan Army. I mean, in that magazine cover that I threw up, there's the army, and then there's the two men with Muslim caps, who are presumably Bengali. They're the center.
Yes, the war crimes tribunals were.
No, right, absolutely. But they were pro-Pakistan.
Yes. Yes.
And so what I'm trying to say is, I found the puppet tearing to be very disturbing for me, and I could at this point see it being used as a propaganda mechanism, as used as a nationalist device. And I'm seeing this in a lot of places where you use war movies to sort of, you only see the glorifying aspects of war to sort of create this uprising, which in many ways was happening in Shahbag, I guess. And then I'm just wondering, do you see your responsibility as a filmmaker changing over time in how you depict complexities? Because in many ways, this...
Yeah, well, that's what I was saying, why we sort of went through this phase of self-critique in the aftermath of this film. And, after showing it around the country for 3 years, we made a follow-up film that was kind of our way of engaging in dialogue with our previous work through the voices of people who critiqued that film. But it's hard in any one moment. Once you make a film, it goes out into the world and it has its own journey, and it's not always clear where that journey is going to take it. So at the time that we were making this film, it seemed like it was important to contest the things that we were contesting because they had been suppressed, by 15 years of military rule. And, once the film was released and there was a big movement and, the government was overthrown, things shifted. There was so much shape-shifting that took place after that. I mean, we would have to have a crystal ball, to know where that would take us, or take the film even, and how it might be used. We never would have imagined in 1995 the dimension that things took and the way in which the film was re-perceived again and again in the succeeding decades. So I think, you can only think about the moment in which you're releasing a film and whether it's appropriate in that historical moment or not. And then you do have a responsibility. But what comes after that, down the line, it's very hard to predict.
In 1995, it would have been impossible to foresee that there would be a law 20 years later that says that saying in any form that the death toll from the war is anything less than 3 million is a punishable offense. And that presenting any history of Bangladesh that includes a narrative of 1947 to 71, which doesn't show that those events were inevitably leading to 71, is also not allowed. That second one hasn't been prosecuted yet, but it's available under the law. So, we went from 1995 where the film couldn't get released, so you're pushing against the government and, Sajjad Sharif's newspaper, which I don't think was Pothinol at the time, publishes publishes an article about the film to make the argument that we have to release it. That's, you're trying to do a workaround around the government. 20 years later, if your film had been made now, you'd need to start with 3 million. As, in the first
right,
film.
We would face a completely different kind of censorship,
Right,
but it would
right.
be censorship. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, the ground has shifted completely. I'm personally hesitant about this terminology of responsibility because it's killed a lot of film in general. People trying to make responsible films about the garments industry, let's say, and making films that maybe aren't the films they wanted to make, but thought that's the film they should make. But that's an aesthetic independence project.
First of all, thank you very much. That was really informative. I have maybe I will focus on another side. Don't you think the problem is with the formula itself? the theatrical documentary where you actually manipulate or try reenact whatever happens back then. And that, as any creator, you have to create something attractive. You have to create something that, that make more audience and wow the audience, because the real life narrative is normally blunt and doesn't have that much of, even for a war narrative or a historical event like that. Don't you think, from the first place, this kind of filmmaking should not be around, especially on sensitive topic like that? Again, this is the devil advocate kind of point of view. I just want to throw it there.
I mean, I think, this film and this footage exists, and especially existed in 1995 in a context of utter deficit of images of the war. I grew up with badly recreated images of the war, with the Pakistan soldiers always jumping off the trucks and the trucks always looking a particular way. And then suddenly, here's this film, it's in color. It's got sound. You can actually hear what people are saying. It's got some variation of sync sound. So it's like a drought in which suddenly this film arrives, which is 800 times more than what people expect. Right? So the analog that I think of is, there's vast amounts of film footage around 1968 in France. The cameras were there, multiple television stations were there, and the French were very young and old. Even the critics of the movement were very much in the mode of, we're documenting history. So everything that was filmed was preserved. You don't need a Lear level. You've got hours and hours of footage taken from every angle. So there's a series of films that have come out on the 50th anniversary, 2018, of France 68. And many of these films have these effect where, the footage is being shown, the footage is talking about one thing, and the narration is doing something completely different. Actually, the narration is saying to you, don't believe this image, right? Or things are not as they presume to be. So one example, I don't know how much people followed 68 France, but Danny the Red, who was one of the sort of leaders thrown up by the movement, had to leave France and travel. And then there's an image of him on the road, but it's in a fashion magazine. So you instantly look at that image and go, oh, the revolution's already gone, because what are you doing posing in a fashion magazine? You're Danny the Red, right? So it's both our visual literacy and expectations of this moment. We're already in a moment of skepticism, and also the availability of this footage and the director's willingness to undermine the image, to say Danny the Red wasn't all that, perhaps, or he was wrong. But one of the reasons that filmmaker or those filmmakers can do that is because there's so many films on France 68, right? It's over documented in some ways compared to, let's say, East Pakistan, West Pakistan, 1969. It's the age of uprisings, 68, 69. There's no film footage of Pakistan, 68, 69. So in that drought, in that absence of images, again, even though I push back again the responsibility term, I think there's so much pressure on the one footage that anyone has found to, because there's no other record. If there's an official record, you can say, okay, that was the official record. Now let's talk about why is she reading Cancer Word? What does it say about her class background, right? And what does it say about this upper middle class English speaking communities connect or disconnect from the war, and how they will not actually be in control of the situation after the war. In fact, if we just talk about these musicians, there's a brief moment right after the war where they show up in newsreel footage, partially because they can speak English, right? So they're interviewed by, there's like little clips of these same people, and then they disappear from the landscape of state governance, right? But I can't talk about any of them when there isn't any film yet, right? So this film has had intense pressure on it in 1995 and still does today, because there isn't a second film that's come out using archival material from the war. And I don't think there's another cache of footage waiting, because it's not, France 68 is a television uprising. They instantly go to television and talk, and all of that's preserved. And this is not. So I think, again, I dislike the term responsibility and I push back on it, but I also think when you find this footage, there is so much responsibility. And I've spoken to Lear once or twice, both with and without Catherine present, and he couldn't make the film, right? He couldn't figure out what to do. The war ended, he didn't know what to do with this footage. Tariq and Catherine appeared as a godsend to rescue the footage, right? But I think in his process somehow was also this, so much of what happened after 71 actually collapsed the promises of 71. That is very hard to make a film. I don't think I actually played the song, but there's a song where he's saying, you know, all the Hindus and Muslims and Christians and Buddhists of Bengal are all Bengali, right? I mean, you look at that footage now, and then you look at the statistic of the disappearing Hindu population in Bangladesh. It's very hard to digest that lofty claim, right? More so today. Yeah.
I have a small comment. Thank you for the talk. And, it's to continue along the lines of what you were saying, and also a little bit towards what you said about different audiences receiving the film in different ways. When it comes to the idea of truth and fiction and all of these discourses, there was a middle class narrative of the war. I mean, there are different versions of the truth, and there are different class narratives of the truth as well. And while there were fictional bits of the film that you recreated or rewrote or wrote for the first time, there was this narrative that existed. It may not have been the only one, but it was one that was still true. And I think that says something about, because I can only speak to the middle class audiences because I saw it for the first time on a large screen at the TAC of the Dhaka University, where they showed it when it first opened, and then I saw it at the public library, and then I saw it at home. And there were already 3 different ways of looking at the film, even for a middle class audience.
Even
so
within a city, yeah.
Exactly. So even within the urban scene, there are many ways of looking
There's
at
a
the
student
film.
way of seeing it, you know, there's sort of the average middle class way of seeing it. I mean, Abbas Kiarostami, the Iranian filmmaker, said that, you know, film is a chain of lies that lead you to a greater truth, right? So, and it's interesting to think of documentary in that way, but that's an ongoing debate in documentary. Even the most purist documentary filmmakers will readily admit that they are manipulating the images, they're manipulating the sound, the framing, the very framing of the camera is manipulation, right? So what is truth in that sense? So you have to think about what is the greater truth, you know, the sort of broader truth of what you're trying to say, and aside from whatever those smaller manipulations are. And there are degrees of manipulation. Maybe we took a little more license than, you know, a cinema verite filmmaker would have taken. But yes, in a sense, I think that's why it was embraced as truth by those audiences that you talk about, including yourself, because it was a reflection of your own ideal perceptions and understanding of the war, right?
This is such a great conversation, and thank you, both of you actually, for being here. I was wondering, so the film was made in 95.
Yeah.
In 95. Can you, can one trace moments in the political history of the viewership of this film in Bangladesh, about when it gets watched? Like, who is asking you to watch the film, and who where does it get screened? Are there moments which coincide with the political history of Bangladesh, or maybe not, where the film gets watched more? I'm thinking of this in the context of India a lot right now, where there is a revision of war films, not in terms of sort of post-colonial wars, but in terms of sort of the pre-colonial wars.
The Subhash Bose film you're thinking of, right?
No, even before that, like Shivaji, and, you know,
Right.
Big budget.
So revisiting sort of Indian historical battlefields and historical battle heroes, and one can think of several reasons why that is happening right now in this moment. But as in the sort of between 95 and 2020, I'm thinking of the ecosystem of the film, like apart outside universities, which are sort of, you know, always candidates for film watching, but in terms of more public spectatorship, at the same time competing with other war films, like you were beginning to say. So I wanted to hear a little more about this broader genre of war films, both feature, documentary, docufiction, and place of this film in relationship to that, in relationship with sort of the political history of Bangladesh. This is a big question. But as somebody who hasn't seen the film, I have heard all her friends, Bangla speaking friends, talk about it, but never seen it. I'm very curious about, the genealogy,
It's a really interesting question.
I mean, I was trying to pull up the poster of the one other film that we didn't talk about, but together shows how the Masuds also did this thing of sort of subverting their own film, right? So they make MUKTIR GAAN, and I'm speaking out of turn perhaps,
No,
but
that's
just my
okay.
interpretation is that they are dissatisfied with the middle class privileging of that film, and then they make a second film, which is MUKTIR Kotha, which then has, as you saw in that image, women in the villages, and they're talking about, well, this is the rich people's war, right? And then you have Nari Rakaptur, and then they make a fourth film, whose poster I was looking for, which is a fiction film, short film set in a barber shop. And barber shops were
Much later, that's 2000.
much later, right? But it's kind of, to me, the part of the 71 arc, because that's the next one, dealing with 71. Fiction film, but barber shops in Dhaka, parts of Dhaka, were known to be places where all the hair cutters were Urdu speakers. Right? Urdu speakers were clustered in various places, for example, in the railway colonies, but barbershops were the one place where you'd interface with them, right? And even today, in Dhaka and Mohammadpur, many of the barbershops are still Urdu speakers, right? That film, short, but actually it's kind of like a grenade in the middle of the 71 discourse. It's an Urdu-speaking barbershop, and a freedom fighter takes refuge, and then the Pakistan army shows up and says, "Where's the Mukti?" Meaning, where's the freedom fighter? And the Urdu speakers go, "Oh, there's no Mukti here," and then they leave, and then they wink. It's a fantastic film. It's short, but he's being shaved, and you think, "Oh, this guy's gonna cut his throat," and instead he just
there's all this imagery of the
Yeah.
blade.
blade, and he
Rubbed
thinks
on
you
his
think
throat.
he's about to like gush fountains of blood, and then instead they rescue him. Very short economic film, and I remember that premiere at Public Library. There was immediately a reaction of like, "Well, are you trying to say the Urdu speakers were all right?" So, as a film group, Tarek and Catherine, as well as Mishuk and others that work with them, continuously undermine their own legacy, right? Short-circuited it, said we're not satisfied with this, which is why I think the film isn't as favorite an object of the government now. Yes, there were those screenings in Shahbag, but you won't see massive screenings by the government. For example, the leader of the movement, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, he's not really that prominent in the film. So that's like an uncomfortable. I would say that 1995 was a very specific thing, which is that it was still the party in opposition that, for whatever set of reasons, felt that the war narrative didn't help them, even though it's a bit idiotic because they were founded by someone who fought in the war. And then 1996 is the first arrival after a military government of the party that felt they could gain from the narrative, right? The Joy Bangla slogan is also that party's slogan in some ways. There's a two-part to it, first part and the second part. And so I think 95, 96, it was embraced by that political party as well on their own initiative. And then soon after not, because I think they could understand that these are not loyal filmmakers, right? Like not
Once we made MUKTIR Kotha, yeah.
Right. It wasn't so comfortable. MUKTIR Kotha has, the thing about the peasant uprising format is that's not at all to do with the party leadership.
And there's a song critiquing the party actually in that film.
Right. Yeah. So they became, the crop of the war, which
Crop
written
War
by,
was reaped by the rich.
right, written by Tariq Masud, right?
Yeah.
That song, yeah. If it's possible to watch all four films together, MUKTIR GAAN, MUKTIR Kotha, Nari Rakaptur, and Noroshundur, it's
Nari Kotha.
Nari Kotha, sorry.
Yeah.
It's quite extraordinary.
But I think also you were asking about this MUKTIR GAAN particularly and what its journey was, sort of in those various shape-shifting stages of the kind of discourse around national identity and the changing, political landscape and all of that. So when was there more of a demand for it, or when was there less of a demand for it? Wasn't that sort of your question also?
Yeah, my question came, full confession, my question came from, I view a lot of Pakistani TV dramas, and without realizing sometimes I'm watching a lot of ISPR stuff, which is the media wing of the Pakistani army, and suddenly you're watching perfectly ordinary love story, and there's a scene about the Pakistani military academy's drill, right? So you're like, why is that happening? And then you realize, you're actually watching stuff which is being funded by the media wing of the Pakistani military.
Right.
So I'm thinking, like, even in terms of watching culture, like public cultures of watching and consuming media itself, does this film get screened, I don't know, every Independence Day celebrations on Pakistan, on Bangladeshi television or not? You know, like those kinds of public
It
spectatorship
does.
where
It does. Not every year, but every few years it gets screened on national television. Yeah, and not more recently though. Interestingly,
not more recently.
Not more recently. You know, and there were phases when, you know, after the party that led the independence movement came back into power in '96, they lost power in 2001. And so then this film again became more popular. And I think, you know, there was a time when there was a reaction against the film because the party was being so repressive. But it'd be really interesting to dissect it, because we never intended this film to be in any way associated with any political party. We took our pains to do so. In fact, in the opening part of the film, we show Sheikh Mujib, the leader of the independence movement, giving his famous speech, March 7th speech. But then we also show Zia Rahman, who was the leader of the main
Opposition party,
BNP. We show a group of soldiers listening to his pronouncement over the radio, which was his sort of claim to fame of leadership in the war, that, you know, sort of proclaiming the independence from Pakistan. So we included both of those. And there
Which
was
made
a
no one
amount of
happy.
controversy about that also.
which made no one happy.
Which made nobody happy, right? And then they were like, well, you didn't include the right recording. He doesn't say his own name. I was like, there's no recording in existence where he says his own name. Okay, Zia Rahman says on behalf of the great national leader, but it's him. And we have the titles there that say that it's him. So, I mean, you know, eventually we were nowhere, right? We were neither here nor there. In terms of the film, but I think that's a really interesting question, because it would be really interesting to trace it in terms of when the request came in for it to be shown on television, public screenings, you know, when they came. Even in that period, 1995 to 96, there were kind of phases, you know, of the way in which it was screened. Because it started, we had no distributor, we had no money. We only had one venue to show the film. We printed our own tickets, we printed our own posters, we had volunteers working for us, we rented 35mm projectors. You know, the whole thing was like a organized exhibition. And the first show, there was hardly anybody there, you know, but within 3 days, we were having to show the film from 9 in the morning until midnight, again and again and again. So it became this cult phenomenon. And then as the movement against the governments, which was a BNP government at that time, started to gain force, at one point it was out of our control. We said, you have to send the film to the street protests and show it to the people in the streets. And there was a stage called the People's Stage, Jonathan Monch, where there was like nonstop, you know, speeches against the government going on as the movement was gaining force. And so we had to take the film, our projection equipment and everything there. And there were 20,000 people in the audience, right? It was crazy. And the mayor turned off all the street lights so that they could see the film. So, you know, so that was sort of that was kind of the peak of the movement. But then the next phase is that we took it outside the city and had that whole other journey of 3 years. So it's something I'd like to write about at some point.
And now it's openly available? Is the film now? How can one
Yeah, I mean, well,
not for my just a
On DVD, I don't know if the revenues go to.
no, I don't.
Yeah.
I don't. Can you still get the DVD and doc? I don't
You
know.
can. I mean, I don't know if those are official.
Yeah.
Official,
No.
so you just
No.
circulate. I just wanted to show the other films in case people also want to. So on the left top is MUKTIR GAAN, followed by MUKTIR Kotha and Naeem Kotha, which images are not there. Then Noroshundur, the barber shop, is the short film on the right. And then Claybird is a fiction film that I had a little bit more of my presentation, but I didn't get to it, where I talked about Claybird as a film which gets into the complexity of the war and the specific role of Islam. precisely because it's fiction. So the characters can get into complex dialogue, which in the documentary is impossible. In the middle is Adam Shurat, which I think has been remastered, and that's
Yes, yes.
Tariq Masud's first film. And I think that's the only one he did before you two became a
Right.
team, and that's with Mishuk Muni. And then Runway, which was the last film, fiction film, on, and then on the top is
That we all did together.
Antar Jatra, which was about a British Bengali. So you also start seeing the gamut of topics, right? There's an immigrant narrative where they're coming back to Bangladesh, which is that train one. Runway is about many things, but about some forms of Islamism, brainwashing, political narrative. But in total, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 films about the war, actually. 3 documentary, 2 fiction,
Right.
which is the largest body by any, I think.
Really?
I think so. In terms of like somebody obsessively making, I mean, Naseeruddin Yusuf hasn't made obsessively films about 71.
Well, he hasn't made that many films.
Right, right. So in Tamil Mukam, I mean, people haven't made that many, and also documentary and fiction back and forth. So,
So a few comments, just reacting to some of the discussion that we had after you talked. And thank you, Naeem, for this really excellent.
thank you for inviting me. Yeah.
Yeah, so something that was evident in Catherine's comments just now, responding to you, is that everything is deeply political, right? Even things that shouldn't be. I mean, this, you can imagine why it gets political. Like over here, we work on what's happening with current sort of refugees in the country, that's political. We work on seasonal hunger, that's somehow political. Arsenic poisoning in water is somehow political. And the government's threatening us with lawsuits. And so, you know, Shahbag came up several times. You know, of course, that ended up being political. But I just wanted to, I mean, it obviously did not happen in a vacuum. And like what the context was. So I think in the country there was this slow drip of normalization of the collaborators who did terrible things. Like December 14th, 13th, just 2 days before when it had become clear that the war was lost, just to maim the new country, you know, going around murdering intellectuals, right? And then from the 80s to the 90s, it was just worried that people are just forgetting and that we can't let it go. Right? And that's where I think that's where that mass movement came about. And I think people's reactions were about that. And at the same time, over the course of this period, we've lost all confidence in the judiciary, right, or in the police, that those were deeply politicized branches of the government again. There was no independence, right? And then that allowed us to say it doesn't really matter what the court says.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, in a situation like that, then films become instruments, and really we cannot novels, any form of art, like any research paper, right, becomes an instrument, right? Any number that like sort of you know, it's a narrative that fits with what you're trying to sell. Either you're with us or you're against us. And then, you know, the other thing that so since Shahbag, the only other mass mobilization we've had since then of that scale was recently students protesting road safety issues, which is again became a very political issue, right? And of course that
December 2018, November
Yeah.
2018. Yeah.
And you know, it just coincidentally has a link to, you know, what you were describing early on in your talk about this sudden stop of this incredible series of films, and the reaction, you know, students are just.
Oh, right, because Tariq and Mishuk also died in a road accident,
Right.
and the protest was about these students who were killed in a road accident. But it was like a powder keg explosion.
Yeah, exactly.
Like many tensions. I wanted to add something. It's not a response to what you said, but as you're thinking about it, the thing that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about is what has happened to the war narrative around Islam, and how it has become, you know, hopelessly confounded in terms of any practices around it. I've actually, with Catherine's permission, maybe show a tiny clip from Claybird, because it kind of illustrates some of these tensions. But just in very simple terms, flattening terminology, but those of us considering ourselves secular progressives had a broad understanding of the position of Islam, that the way to argue against Islam in governance or state or politics is to always go back to 1971. That's like the sort of basic foundation. And the foundational element of that is exactly what Mushfiq again invoked, that the death squads that killed intellectuals at the end, because obviously the Pakistan army doesn't know where the Bengali professor or the mathematics professor lives. That would only be known by, I mean, they don't, because the war didn't last long enough to have those kinds of lists. So you would need Bengalis to make those lists, right? Or Bangladeshis or East Pakistanis. So the war narrative also always was a way to stop the rise of Islam. The most common phrase that used to be used in the 80s and 90s is, we don't want to have religion because 71. Right? Even though things kept happening that kept eroding that idea, right? There's secularism in the Constitution in 72, there isn't now. There was no reference to religion, now there is. Islam is listed in the Constitution. So things were changing continuously, but still there was an idea that, broadly speaking, Islamism could be, I've used this phrase in an article, could be pushed back using the weapon of 71. So the 71 narrative is also a de-Islamization narrative, right? Although not in this film, that's why Claybird is quite unique within that. And all of that got short-circuited and imploded by Shahbag, because by the time of Shahbag, it's 2013, first of all. So the position of Islam, Islamism, Islamist parties is incredibly more complex. Not only just because of the post-9/11 dispensation, but also because of the mutation of Islamic parties in Bangladesh. So there's a new set of Islamic parties that have no link to 71. Some of the leadership is dead, so it's a young leadership. And Jamaat Islamic Party was actually actively trying to make their leadership younger, precisely to get out of the 71 stigma, because if you weren't born in the war, then you can't be accused of being a war criminal. So, and even the position of progressive liberal opinion about Islam was also changing, right? It wasn't so binary, it was incredibly multifaceted and contradictory. And Shahbag sort of made all of that explode, because it's a mass movement. So first there's hanging, then there's an attempt to make a list of all businesses with a link to the Islamist party. Then you start getting into massive terrain. You get into one of the largest banks in the country, at which point the powers that be also start getting very nervous. It's fine to be on the streets demanding execution of a few people, but not what you do with the banks, right? Not the national, it becomes about economy and business and the idea of, making lists of businesses that won't be allowed to function because they have an Islamist link, where you get into an incredibly fuzzy territory, because what if you're an Islamist who's born in 75 or 79, etc., etc. And so I think now some of the very comforting binaries that we used to have as a weapon against Islamism, which also included the slogan of, well, we're not Pakistan and this is why, etc., or this won't happen, also got hopelessly scattered and hasn't rebuilt itself now, which I think is a good segue to just a short clip from Claybird, which is the fiction film. It got the director's prize at GAAN, I think.
Yeah.
And it came out, that's an accident, but it came out after 9/11, so it also kind of inadvertently landed into other discourse that people were already thinking of. And so the film is set in a madrasa during the war, and this is a short scene where they're debating what the war means for Islam.
কিন্তু কমিউনিস্টপন্থীরা ধর্ম নিরপেক্ষতা শুরু করছে, তা ইসলামের খতরার কারণে দাঁড়িয়ে এদের মোকাবিলা না করলে কেমনি চলবে?
তাহলে কমিউনিস্ট আর রাজনীতি আলাদা লগে আঙ্গু ফারাকটা থাকতো না।
লেকিন ইসলামকে রাজনীতি থেকে আলাদা করবে কিভাবে? এখন তো পাকিস্তানকে জারি রাখাই মুশকিল হয়ে পড়ছে। পাকিস্তান যদি ভেঙে যায় তাহলে এই অঞ্চলে ইসলামের অবস্থা খাতারনাক হয়ে পড়বে।
আচ্ছা আলিম মিয়া, আমি একটা কথা কোন চাই, পাকিস্তান বহাল না থাকলে ইসলামের অবস্থা বেয়াল হয়ে যাবে। কেমনে বুঝলে পাকিস্তান কি ইসলাম কায়েম করছে না মিলিটারি হুকুমত কায়েম করছে?
The end. It's a great film. Everyone should see all the films. Maybe have a retrospective screening at Yale. Catherine is nearby, and you teach at.
I teach at University of Connecticut.
Right, so there's linkages and leverages. Yeah, having you here very much makes up for the situation in London, where I felt that I was speaking into a void where nobody felt either for or against the topic. It was neutral.
Right. It was probably much more abstract.
Yeah, it was abstract, so people were talking about the imagery, and it took too long to explain the situation also.
Right. It's too much context. Well, thank you, Naeem.
Thank you, Catherine.
you,
being
and
here.
thank you
Thank you,
everybody for
Mushfiq,
coming.
for organizing. Thank you, Ahmed.